The Africa Free Trade Bloc is officially open for business, but is it really? Experts have said that the New Year Free Trade launch is largely symbolic and it will be years before its aims are finally realized. We're joined by Patrick Bond, professor and researcher. Dr. Vuyo Mjimba will also be joining us for this particular conversation a little later on. Prof, let's just begin with, this particular agreement. It was always seen by some as good news, but others have said that on paper it looks like it's a great idea, all systems go, things are looking great, but it's a little bit more complex in reality.
Yes, I mean, you've just seen at the Beitbridge Messina border how so many delays associated with COVID-19 testing meant 5 days in the queue, and there's even longer queues on the border of Kenya and Uganda. So where we want to get rid of irrational borders that were basically put down in 1885 in a Berlin conference where no Africans were there. There are problems. I mean, these governments are often relying on the tariffs, on the taxes that they put onto imported goods just to make money for their own government's operations. And in general, Africa in the world economy has been a very complicated and mostly negative relationship, starting with slavery, where the old colonial companies, our own Dutch East India Company or British South Africa Company, or the transnational corporations, whether they're from the West or from the BRICS countries, that have been very exploitative. And the question is, can our indigenous African manufacturing, especially, now rise to the occasion of a huge bloc and overcome some of those historic disadvantages?
And Prof, when one really looks at what is currently unfolding at some of the borders, I mean, you look at Libombo, some people have been there for, even over 4 days, saying that they have not even had access to water and all of that. And then you look at some of the infrastructure that then becomes a problem for this particular agreement to then get underway. Surely this is also going to, make things even more difficult for this particular agreement to actually get into full swing.
Oh, and of course, if Bongiwe, the COVID-19 variant in South Africa is as rapidly spreading as we can expect, who can blame Zimbabweans for saying, slow down, if you're coming to Zim from South Africa, are you carrying that? So that was the main source of the recent delays at our main land border. But the airlines are another source of worry. Infrastructure wise, as you say, because some of them have crashed. I mean, the biggest and most, highest quality airline on the African continent for decades was South African Airways. It really doesn't exist anymore. And the ability to, let's say, use airports and aerotropolises and all of the visions that the air transport would help us, that's, I think, also in question because of COVID-19. And I think also the highly subsidized character of our competitors, who are mainly in the Middle East, aside from Ethiopian Airlines, where we're really losing in South Africa from intra-African air trade to the big airlines like Emirates and Qatar and even the Turkish Air. And then finally, the ports. Our ports in Africa are being rebuilt, and it's often Chinese investments. But, that then requires us to ask, is it still neo-colonial, in which the infrastructure relates from a plantation or a mine, then along a road or a railroad across bridges to the port for export-oriented primary commodities, raw materials? And those are the dilemmas, because if we're really just going to rebuild some of the ports as our hope of making intra-African trade work, it might have the opposite effect of promoting, again, export-led growth and primary commodity growth.
And, Prof, when one looks at intra-Africa trade, it hasn't really been at volumes that, a lot have been hoping for in the previous years. Could we see a reversal of this through such an agreement?
Yes, I mean, the statistic we often hear is 16% of intra-African economic activity. That's the trade, and that compares very unfavorably to Europe, where it's well over 60%, or to Asia, close to 50%. So with so little trade between the borders of Africa, across those borders, it's partly because of the fragmentation, and we don't have economies of scale. That's the whole point, is to change that. And then we'd maybe see manufactured goods, like the ones you're seeing now, manufactured by Africans in factories in Africa rather than importing them from cheap locations in East Asia. And then the big question, to get the economies of scale, will those factories be mainly in places like Johannesburg? And if that's the case, are we just replacing the import of East Asian goods with the import to the rest of the continent from a very powerful manufacturing base, South Africa? Because African countries used to manufacture as a share of their GDP about 22%, and it's down to less than half that at the moment. Everyone wants to see manufacturing, real production, and they want to see it in a way that's not carbon intensive, since Africa is the most climate vulnerable. And I think the fear would be that we have some, wicked companies in Johannesburg. Our Johannesburg businesses are rated currently by PwC as the second most economically crime-riddled or corrupt in the world, tied with China, behind only India. Our government, in contrast, is rated by Transparency International number 110. So I would keep an eye, if I were from the rest of the continent, I would keep an eye on Johannesburg companies trying to dominate the continent, where there's a word for it, sub-imperialism, because that might be a real problem given the ethical challenges of the companies mainly operating, in Sandton and Stellenbosch and Mhlanga in central Cape Town. Those are companies that, if I were from the rest of the continent, I'd maybe be worried about as a potential unintended consequence of an Africa-wide, we might see more unequal and uneven development within Africa.
Prof, I do understand that we've got Dr. Vuyo Mjimba, who's also joining us in this particular conversation. I'd like to bring him in here. Dr. Mjimba, good evening, and thank you so much for your time tonight. We've been speaking with Prof about, this particular agreement and how, just in theory, it looks like it's easy. Things could really work. It's simple. But certainly when one looks at it in reality, particularly when you look at what has been happening in our borders, and from what Prof has just described now, potential dominance that we could be seeing from some of these players, it does look like it might be complex in reality.
Thank you very much, and good evening to you and all the viewers. Yes, it is complex, but complexity is how we make it. If we want it to be complex, we can make it complex. If we want to simplify it, we can simplify it. I think if you look at anything that you look at in life, if you want to complicate it yourself, you can. But when I've done a little bit of work on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, I think there are certain things that we are complicating ourselves that can be simplified, and there are some complex things. One of the things that I've always argued with colleagues is that sometimes we seem to be putting the cart before the horses. We're already talking about the rules of trade, but we haven't even answered the question, trading in what? How? And I always give this example. If you look at all the social media that we have, from WhatsApp to Zoom to whatever, what came first, the rules or the technology? You'll find that the rules followed when the thing had been invented. Can't we take that approach cautiously? Taking care of all other things that can go wrong. Yes, there is the issue of dominance by the others, but are we in a better position being dominated? Certain countries, are they not in a better position whilst this domination is going under the African Continental Free Trade Agreement than now, when it is not there, when there is absolutely nothing happening? I think for me, when I look at it, especially, it's if you look at it heuristically and you look at it, what the trade opportunities that it presents, I think it is a chance that's worth exploring. Anything in life is filled with uncertainty. The biggest question is what risks need to be taken and how can we mitigate those risks?
And if you don't mind answering that very question, Dr. Mjimba, because there are many risks here, and which are those that you would say are worth taking here?
I think the biggest risk that we have is the other countries dominating the others. Perhaps when that one is given and we can't do much about it, because these countries are starting from different state of development. If you compare, take for instance South Africa and perhaps its neighbors Zambia, Mozambique, Swaziland, Lesotho, Zimbabwe. Look at the level of industrialization here in South Africa and compare with those countries. If we start trading, those countries are going to start lower. They are not going to benefit as much as South Africa. But there is something that people always forget. If we are integrated into any value chain, you are not, in whatever mode you are integrated, you are not locked in there. We always talk about value chain upgrading. And I find that value chain upgrading gets missing in some of these discourses. Where you start from doesn't determine where you will end. You can innovate. You can innovate and even leapfrog above all the leaders. If you take, I was watching a very interesting issue on about Rwanda delivering blood through drones. Look, they didn't invent drones, but they are using them to mitigate issues of their poor roads. So what is it that we can do? Not starting is not an option for me. So we need to look at those risks, and I think the other risk is if we are left out of the value chain, we are not going to benefit. And those are big ones. So I would rather take the risk of being integrated and fight to upgrade myself so that I can reap higher returns.
Mm. And Professor Bond, I'd like to bring you back into this discussion. I want us to look at another issue about the scaling up of production to meet the demand, because that might also be, part of the problem here, because there may be countries that are not able to meet, the particular production that is then needed to meet the consumer demand, which then means that then we could see this dominance that you're talking about.
Yes, and we definitely need these economies of scale, so bulk production. Many would say that we lost our own basic industries. Let's just take a few of them. Clothing and textiles and footwear, or appliances or electronics. That when I moved to South Africa about 30 years ago, they were, very, very strong, and the GDP was about 24% manufacturing. And now those have been completely demolished, well, a few exceptions, but really destroyed by competition, because the East Asian market, especially the Chinese, have these economies of scale. They can produce much lower. And the other critical thing is they aren't really paying the full cost of production. They externalize costs. The environment takes a big hit, including in the shipping and the transport of these goods. So if they can get the rules of origin and really make sure that we are going back to producing the full value chain, or as much of it as possible, on the African continent, I think scaling up is absolutely what everyone wants to do. But just as Vuyo said, there are going to be debates about rules of origin. Where do these goods that are being sold in Africa really come from? And we had one bad example a couple of years ago when a new car company, the Beijing Auto Industrial Corporation, moved to the Kucha Special Economic Zone. And very quickly there were allegations, which I think were probably at least partly true, of this being a dumping ground for knockout kits where, they were said to be made in Kucha in Nelson Mandela Bay, but actually they were brought in and just, hammered together at the last moment by some workers. And it's a very automated process. So I think having, let's not say a very sophisticated value chain, but one that we can all examine and insource and outsource from the rest of the continent as appropriate. And I hope that's a replacement for a different ideology, one that we've been, foisted upon us by the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, which is just get rid of all regulations, all borders, all exchange controls. And if we can get rid of borders on trade, but keep some of the other integrity, if there is any, in exchange controls and regulations, then I think you'd have a much better free trade area. It'd have a lot more integrity and much less cheating. I do worry about cheating, given that, it's basically white South African, what do they call it, WMC, white monopoly capital. Maybe a little better to have South Africans doing it than the other WMC, Western multinational corporations. But I think most Africans who work in the public interest will have to keep a very close eye on whether South Africans and maybe some of the other big corporates on the continent based in Nigeria and in Kenya and in Egypt and Morocco, whether they're going to take advantage of this and violate rules of origin and maybe, bring in a kind of sub-imperial economic arrangement.
I tell you what, there's a lot to talk about when it comes to this particular subject. I mean, we have not even looked at the possible coordination of industrial policies. But thank you so much to you both for your time. We certainly do appreciate it. That was Professor Patrick Bond and Dr. Vuyo Mjimba.